I made notes.
Tristan, do you want to stand? Tristan, do you want this and that?
Oh, no, it's good. I don't need to read off of it. Mostly it's like a little comfort thing. So hi, my name is Tristan. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a pretty new member here at UVC and a new Chicagoan. It was very weird. I recently traveled for a conference and people said, where are you from? And I was like, I guess I'm from Chicago now. I moved here from Rochester, New York over the summer to be with my beautiful partner, Red. So both of us joined recently. The thing that I wanted to talk about, one of the ways that I experience God in my life now, has to do with the correspondence I do with folks who are in prison, which I came up here last month and talked about a fundraiser I was doing. This whole idea got started when Pastor Hannah asked back in November about giving. And I said, well, that's something that I do a lot of. And she was like, well, we mean giving to Urban Village. And I was like, oh, well, don't do that yet. But she was like, but put a pin in that. So I have been corresponding with folks in prison since 2015. It all started back, I used to work for this LGBTQ nonprofit in Rochester, New York. I was like a professional queer. I was the office administrator for the nonprofit, and that meant I, amongst a lot of other things, handled all of the incoming and outgoing mail, Facebook messages, emails, whatever. And one day I went to check our mail, and there was a letter from a trans woman who was incarcerated at the time at Wendy Correctional Facility, which is over in Western New York. And she was asking for resources, and unfortunately I was like, well, there's really nothing we can do for you, but I can write to you. And so I started corresponding. And I was kind of interested in prisons and justice and abolition, and kind of had just this very vague notion. And I thought, well, I can write letters. And at this point in my life, God was not a part of the equation. I wasn't a member of a church. I hadn't gone to church since I was 12 years old. Church meant my missionary Aunt Barb, who's super conservative, or my other aunt who goes to this giant evangelical mega church. That's what all that meant to me. But I started corresponding, and this one person led to more people and more people. And at this point, I correspond with, at any given time, 6 to 7 people very actively, and there's about 24-ish that I'm make sure that I'm kind of keeping up with. But I started to grow this idea of everyone deserves a card on their birthday, which I kind of, when I came into the world of the Christian faith, the word grace was the word that kind of stuck with that. And so I kind of stumbled into grace before I really realized it. And meanwhile, so I started corresponding in February-ish 2015. And then over the summer of 2016, I got sober. And I started going to a 12-step program, which if you have any passing familiarity with how that works, that involves God. And so I started on this kind of opening up on the spiritual journey and was feeling very limited. In the program that I'm in, it sort of talks about a power greater than ourselves. And that wasn't too hard. I was like, well, the weather is bigger than me and the world is bigger than me and all that kind of stuff. But something was still missing, and I wasn't getting this really personal, tangible thing. Meanwhile, I'm doing all this correspondence work, and I'm really kind of growing in my way of talking about grace, although that wasn't the word I used, for everybody, including people who've done really terrible things. And I'm learning about prison abolition and prisoner justice, and I'm running up against a wall that often comes up when we talk about prison abolition, which is, it's very easy to talk about people who are wrongfully accused and say, well, of course they shouldn't be in prison. Or people who are, all the people who just got their sentences expunged or whatever because of the passage of marijuana legalization, right? Those are the easy ones. But what about the people who murdered a bunch of people? How do we talk about people who raped children, right? And as I'm kind of going along, I kind of had taken those parts and just kind of done what a lot of us do and sort of just stuck it to the side. So in 2018, I met Red, and at this point I was about a year and a half sober and really kind of grappling with the God stuff and feeling there's just something, I need something, it's not quite working, I'm trying, I'm awkwardly trying prayer, but to whom and what's happening. And Red lent me this book by Shane Claiborne, Irresistible Revolution, which I read in 3 days, and there was just this little click. And the missing piece to the abolitionist puzzle was the grace that Jesus shows. And so all of a sudden it was like, oh, that's the piece that I've been missing. That's the tangible God, was Jesus, the person of Jesus, that God made into a person. And that kind of very, very unexpectedly launched me into, I wasn't officially a member of a church in Rochester, because by the time that happened, I knew I was moving, and so I didn't sign any paperwork or whatever. But I became an active participant in the church, and then last May, I did a baptismal reaffirmation and kind of started, that's how I kind of landed here and decided to join a church and all that stuff. And I just, every time I get stuck, I come back to this idea that everyone deserves a card on their birthday. And that applies not just to people who are in prison, but to all of us. And that has shaped how I interact with people who are not incarcerated. I should know, I didn't know any of my incarcerated correspondents before I met them. I had never been incarcerated myself. I've visited lots of prisons, but I always get to leave. And now, the thing that kind of I've learned a lot about is you can't be a Christian alone. So I do all this correspondence work, which is just I used to get really kind of icky when people called it a ministry. But now I kind of have come around to understanding what that word means. And there's this, I mentioned when I came up here and talked about the fundraiser, there's this guy named Albert, who I started corresponding with maybe about a year and a half ago, a little more than that. Last winter, he mentioned that it was very cold and he didn't have good shoes to go outside. He's incarcerated at Sing Sing, which is in downstate New York, in a New York City area. And he's older and he didn't have stuff to go outside. It was too cold. And so I thought, well, get you a pair of boots. This was a much more complicated process than expected. The first pair of boots didn't get through because they had metal in them, and then I did a second pair of boots and they didn't get through because they were too tall, and by that point it was May and the boots were now no longer an issue. So this season comes around and I'm like, okay, we're doing this. Try number 3, the boots get rejected because they had 2 colors. And he sent me an email. They have a new system now where they can send me digital letters. And he said something that totally stood out to me, where he was like, I don't really care so much about the boots. I appreciate that, but what I really appreciate is the Christian fellowship, right? And I just I never thought about the fact that all of this correspondence work is part of a spiritual practice of just being a witness for someone. Just being at, people ask me, what do you write about? I'm like, I don't know, whatever's going on in my life. Work is good, or work is boring, or a student is irritating to me, or my boss is annoying, or hey, there's an impeachment going on, what do you think? Right? It's the same stuff I talk to other people about. And it wasn't until I started talking with Albert, who is a pretty active Christian, that I started thinking of that as a spiritual practice. And that is now a lot of how I find God. I do this little, as part of my 12-step stuff, I do a little writing at the end of every day. And one of the things I write is kind of where did I see God today? And I will tell you that it's almost always through a person, somebody that I connected with. And oftentimes it's through somebody that I got a letter from and they said something that just hit me, or just the act of writing the letter. And so that's, the thing that my correspondence work, which started well before I had any interest in God, or, I was off in my alcoholic world, I didn't care, is about grace and fellowship, which are the things that I always come back to, and are the things that most compel me about the person/God of Jesus. And so that's kind of how I wound up here today. I will wrap up with this. Albert did finally get a pair of boots, a pair of gloves, and someone gave him a scarf and a hat. So he sent me a letter. He's like, I'm going outside. So we got it to work. Thank you.
So we always offer a prayer for a person who's giving their testimony. So if you feel comfortable extending a hand, we'll offer a prayer for Tristan, if I can. God of grace, God of power, God of all things, we thank you for the gift that Tristan is to our community. We thank you for these reminders that spiritual practices go well beyond church and Sunday morning, and that the true sense of Christianity comes in the connections that we make with other people, and that grace is for absolutely everyone, and practicing that makes us better Christians. We thank you, and we pray that you will help us to remember that and take those lessons into our own lives. In the name of God we pray. Amen.